Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Andrea Sankey in Paris. In 2 weeks' time, 8 years of Bush administration policy will come to an end, and the Obama administration will assume the many challenges left behind. And one of the most daunting tasks, defining a new U.S. policy role in the Middle East. With Israel's war on Gaza raging through its second week, Iran's regional influence increasing, and Iraq and Afghanistan far from pacified, how should this new regime rebuild failed U.S. foreign policy? That is one of the questions I'll put to Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and former director of policy planning for the U.S. State Department under George W. Bush. He joins me now from New York. Richard Haass, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Is this the worst scenario one administration could pass on to another? I mean, have U.S. foreign policy makers ever been faced with so many grave challenges as they are today?
It's about as difficult as it gets if you add up all the international challenges, many of which are to be found in the greater Middle East, Iraq, Iran, the Israeli-Palestinian question, and so forth, not to mention Afghanistan and Pakistan slightly farther afield, and all of this against the backdrop of domestic and international economic recession. And I think it's this combination of foreign policy challenges and economic difficulties happening simultaneously that immediately brings one back, say, to the 1930s or 40s, when a very different American president, Franklin Roosevelt, faced something that was in some ways parallel, this mixture of international challenge and domestic economic difficulty.
So where do you think the Obama administration needs to start first in respect to foreign policy once it takes over? The Israeli-Palestinian peace process, perhaps?
Well, I wouldn't have said that a month ago, but given the specifics going on in Gaza, the new administration won't have the luxury of ignoring it. So yes, I think there will be tremendous expectation, even pressure, for them to try to bring about a ceasefire. But I would hope they would use the situation they are likely to inherit and try to do something actually quite ambitious, which is to restart negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians and introduce negotiations between the United States and Syria and the United States and Iran. I don't think the administration should try to solve these issues in isolation. I don't think it has the luxury of postponing any of them given the urgency.
Do you believe the right people are now in the right place to do that under the Obama administration, talk to Iran, talk to Syria?
It's not a question of the people so much. It's a question of the policies that the president and his senior aides decide to put into place. But if one takes at face value what was said during the campaign, I think you will see a greater U.S. willingness to turn to diplomatic tools, to have face-to-face negotiations. So I think it's reasonable to predict or expect that we'll see a greater emphasis on diplomacy. It will constitute a dramatic contrast from what one saw in the early years of the Bush presidency, but there'll probably also be some elements of continuity when one looks at the final year of Mr. Bush's 8-year tenure.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little more about issues dealing with Iran in just a minute. But first I want to ask you, if you're at all shocked that Israel has gone to the lengths it has to stop Hamas rocket attacks, and do you think Israel is actually considering the real potential long-term effects in this assault on Gaza?
I'm not surprised in the sense that I knew the Israelis would strike. And if you look at the history of the Israeli use of military force, they actually reject notions of proportionality. They are conscious about acting disproportionately in order to send messages, to deter future uses of force. The Israelis don't want to have rocket shelling become a constant or recurring part of their existence. I think the risk for the Israelis and what they've done, because now they're doing something very large, is that they need to then have results that seem to justify or are commensurate with all that they've invested in this situation. And if they can't do that, then many people, both in Israel but also around the region and the world, will say that the Israelis did not come away with results that in any way justified all the force they used. Interestingly enough, if they are going to succeed, they can't succeed with military force alone. All the military force will do is weaken Hamas. It'll create some sort of diplomatic opening. But then it's up to the United States, Europe, Russia, the UN, and Israel, working with moderate Palestinians and the Arab governments to try to fill that diplomatic space and essentially get Middle East diplomacy back on track.
But you worry that whatever moderates were in the picture before Israel took these military steps might disappear as a result of this action if it goes much further.
It's sooner rather than later. What the Israelis have done militarily needs to be complemented by economic initiatives to improve the standard of living and quality of life of Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank. And even more important, it needs to be complemented by a diplomatic initiative. At the end of the day, there's essentially two paths for the Palestinians. Either there's the path of Hamas, which is essentially one of military force, of rejection, or there's a path of diplomacy and of compromise with Israel. And what the Israelis, working with the international community, need to do is say, those who embrace the path of moderation, of diplomacy, and of compromise, they are ultimately going to get more of a reward than the people with guns. But right now, that's just rhetoric. So the challenge for Mr. Obama will be to turn that rhetoric into reality and to show, to put it bluntly, that moderation pays more than violence.
Okay, there is a distinct possibility, though, that Israel's military actions in this case will serve to embolden Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah in Syria, for that matter, as well.
Sure, there's the danger that if the Israelis only use military force, and that if there's no set of incentives out there, that yes, this could end up increasing the radicalization of an already radical part of the world. So a military-only foreign policy for Israel seems to me would not be in the best interest of either Israel or the United States.
I have to ask you, since you served as the lead U.S. government official in support of the Northern Ireland peace process, we've seen a lot of parallels drawn between bringing peace to Northern Ireland and also bringing peace to Israel and the Palestinians. Do you see real similarities there? Is there perhaps a formula to follow based on Northern Ireland?
I do think there are important similarities. Let me give you what I think is the most basic. Is the British ultimately succeeded in Northern Ireland not because of the use of the police or the British Army alone. It was necessary but not sufficient. It was important to send the message to the people who had the guns, to the Provisional IRA, that they could not shoot their way to power. But just as important was that there had to be a different path, a diplomatic path, where they could peacefully gain power. And I think that's the parallel for the Middle East. People like Hamas have to understand they can't shoot their way to power, but there has to be enough of an incentive so that the majority of Palestinians will choose diplomacy over violence. And that's where Northern Ireland, I think, sets a useful model.
Do you think the region will ever get there?
Gosh, looking at today's events, it's hard to see. Well, I would say is over the last couple of decades, we've actually seen some significant progress. Look at the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. Look at the Jordanian relationship. Look how close we've come to peace. So I don't feel it's by any means impossible. On the other hand, it's not just going to happen by itself. It's not inevitable either. It's going to take real leadership, some very tough decisions. I don't believe Israelis and Palestinians can make peace by themselves. They're going to need the assistance of the United States, of Europe, of Russia, of the UN, and of the Arab governments. I actually think if peace in the region is going to happen, it's probably going to need to be comprehensive at this point rather than piecemeal.
As far as your personal greatest foreign policy concerns are concerned, you've said a lot about the potential for very serious problems arising between Pakistan and India, who are still sorting out a response to the Mumbai attacks. Do you still feel that there is potential danger there?
I'm less worried about an Indian-Pakistani confrontation. I believe the leadership in both countries understand that there would be no winners and only losers if that came about. But I am quite concerned about the continued decay or deterioration within Pakistan itself, its potential to become a failed state, and what that would mean both for Pakistan itself. We're talking about, 170 million people It's the home to the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations. It possesses several dozen nuclear weapons. And I'm worried about the consequences of deterioration in Pakistan, both for what's going on in Afghanistan as well as for stability in India. So when I look at the world and take a step back, and as bad as things are in the Middle East right now, the country in the world that concerns me most is Pakistan.
Okay, but I mean, Iran, as you were saying earlier, I promised we'd get back to it, concerns you rather gravely as well. And you think the solution to Iran, as concerns its nuclear program and proxy wars it fights in the region, boils down to talking to Iranian leaders without preconditions, you've said. But can you imagine really engaging in truly productive talks with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? Because it seems whenever given a forum, he doesn't quite answer questions, but rather recites Iran's history or criticizes U.S. democracy.
No, I've had that personal experience with him. I don't believe that negotiations or consultations should be with him. I don't think that would be particularly useful. In any event, you're going to have an Iranian election in less than half a year, so we'll see who the new leadership of Iran is going to be. But in the first instance, regardless, you would want to carry out negotiations at much more of an official level. And I'm not sitting here predicting that negotiations will succeed. I would simply say that they're worth trying, that in the past there have been some areas where negotiations with Iran have proved productive. I was involved, say, in U.S.-Iranian dialogue about Afghanistan 6-7 years ago after 9/11, and that proved to be quite productive. So it's certainly worth exploring, particularly given the alternatives. What we're seeing now in an imperial Iran promoting instability throughout the Middle East, that's obviously not terribly attractive. And Iran with nuclear weapons is obviously a strategic nightmare. So I back negotiations, largely because I don't much like the alternatives, and I'd also say that I don't think negotiations are destined to fail. With oil at $45, $50 a barrel, the Iranians are feeling tremendous economic pressure. Their government's isolation from much of the world is a source of real unpopularity and controversy at home. So I simply think that diplomacy ought to be explored, and to the extent the United States can do it in tandem with Europe, with Russia, with China, if we can offer Iran a positive future, but at the same time threaten them with all sorts of economic sanctions or conceivably other costs, then I think there's the possibility that diplomacy could, in fact, bring about a much better situation.
Okay, Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us tonight. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. Thanks for your participation. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in as well. That is all for tonight. Bonsoir.